Hello everyone, today I just want to go through an A-Level Economics past paper question. This should be from a paper 2 at Edexcel. I think it is the 2023. So the question is giving us this little blurb, right? In 2022, the value of UK exports fell by 14% compared with 2020. In contrast, the global average increase in exports was 8.2% over the same time period. The UK's competitiveness also fell, dropping 5 places from 18th to 23 in the World Competitiveness Ranking. Evaluate the macroeconomic policies that could increase international competitiveness in the UK's export markets. So I'm going to give you an idea of how I would answer this question, just an outline. Obviously, there are many different ways to answer a question like this, but hopefully this gives you a bit of guidance about what would be appropriate or what would give you the most marks for a question like this. So the question's asking us to evaluate macroeconomic policies. Generally, I will pick two. So my sort of two big paragraphs are going to be analyzing two different macroeconomic policies that will try and increase the competitiveness of the UK's export markets. And I've gone for two here. One is, as you can see, labour market deregulation. The other is reducing trade barriers, so like lowering tariffs, trying to negotiate better bilateral trade deals to reduce friction when you're trading. I realize some of you might look at labour market deregulation and think that's a microeconomic policy. Really, it can be a micro or a macroeconomic policy depending on what it's targeting. So if the objective of labour market deregulation is just to make companies more profitable, that's going to be microeconomic focused. But you can think about it as a macroeconomic policy if it's trying to target export markets as a whole, right? If it's trying to boost overall economic performance, overall exports. And if you check the mark scheme for this question, it does include deregulation and things like lowering the minimum wage as valid macroeconomic policies in this context. So this is fine. But you could also opt for something to do with exchange rates. You could opt for something that's maybe more traditionally macroeconomic if you really want to play it safe. This would be fine. When we're talking about labour market deregulation, I'm generally going to give some examples of what this looks like. So probably this is stuff like lowering the minimum wage. It might be sort of lowering safety standards. It might be reducing the regulations around hiring and firing workers to make it easier for companies to hire and fire workers. In terms of definitions that I want to provide for this, generally I want at least one technical definition when I'm answering a question. I could go here with supply side policies or with the marginal cost of labor. So supply side policies aimed at increasing the productive capacity of the economy by improving the efficiency of labor or capital markets. There's a few different definitions of this you could use. Marginal cost of labor, so the additional cost of employing an additional unit of labor, and then the objective here would be that deregulation can reduce the marginal cost of labor by removing restrictions like minimum wage laws and redundancy protections. So these, you're going to probably wrap up a definition of what you mean by labour market deregulation with some of these more technical terms that show off your knowledge of the course material. When you're explaining this, you're definitely going to want to utilize some kind of diagram. There's a few that would work here. So I've included two. One is just a classic ASAD diagram. It shows the increase in your aggregate supply that comes when you reduce the marginal cost of labor. And the thing I'm really paying attention to here is the drop in the price level. So I would use this in part when I'm just illustrating the overall increase in output in the economy as a result of the marginal cost of labor. Obviously, this is not super specific to international trade, but it can help you illustrate the point that you're making. This one over here, which is less common in the A-Level Economics course, but is more specific to trade, would be a current account balance diagram. So this is showing the relationship between the balance in the current account and the exchange rate. So as you get a more favorable exchange rate, you're also getting a more favorable current account balance. And you're also getting, here, when you get these marginal cost of labor policies implemented, you get this rightward shift in the current account balance, meaning that you're able to have more net exports for an exchange rate that's less favorable. So that would be basically how you illustrate this point using macroeconomic diagrams, because there are labor market diagrams that are more micro focused, but really the emphasis here is going to be on analyzing the effects on trade, which is what makes this a macroeconomic focused point. in terms of an example, again, I wouldn't necessarily expect you to be able to use a real world example here. But if you can, that's amazing. And what I would use here are the Hartz reforms in Germany, which is all about how Germany liberalized their labor markets, which has led to them being able to support high-tech manufacturing, because generally Germany's macroeconomic policies are targeting having more competitive wages, which allows them to have more competitive exports. That's the basis of their economic model. So I'd use that as an example. In terms of analysis, the explanation here is going to be something like reducing, like labor market rate deregulation. Deregulation will lead to a lowering of the marginal cost of labor, as both because, so I give maybe some examples here, right? So because like lowering minimum wage, it could also be because you are, for example, lower expected cost of hiring an employee because firms can fire them more easily, so are more willing to take on more workers, and reduced redundancy costs are part of the cost of labor. So you might not think about things like severance packages as being part of labor costs, but they are, right? When a company is assessing how much it costs them to hire a worker, the cost of potentially firing that worker is factored in, because a lot of your workforce eventually are going to have to be let go. Maybe they need to be compensated when they do. So firms are generally, one, it's going to make it just on average less expensive to have workers, but also it means that companies are potentially more willing to hire more workers because they know they can get rid of them if they need to, like if conditions in the market change. So generally, like firing flexibility increases the ease of hiring for for employers as well. This leads to lower costs of production, which then leads to potentially more price competitiveness with firms in other markets. Okay, and so in terms of an evaluation for this, I'm going to focus on why this policy might be counterproductive, but really, if I can, I want to be specifically focused on export markets. So you could say labor market deregulation is bad because, that's going to be bad for workers, maybe it's going to reduce domestic demand. That's not necessarily wrong as an evaluation, but the best evaluation is going to be one that targets the thing we're talking about, which in this case is the international competitiveness of UK manufacturing. So in this case, I would want to focus on the loss of talented employees to other markets, which could undermine the export competitiveness in high-skill manufacturing. So kind of like with the Germany example, if the goal is to be like really into producing amazing engines for cars, that sort of industry, you need to be able to retain high-quality workers. And so if you have poor worker protections, if you have lower wages, it might be harder to do that. And then I've also added here that it's still unlikely to be price competitive with countries that have, say, weaker currencies. So because wages in the UK are so much higher than wages in, say, Cambodia, the fact that you've reduced those labor costs by maybe like 5% isn't really going to make you competitive with those countries. Maybe it does make you more competitive with Germany, for example, for the high value manufacturing, but it's not going to make you like the cheapest market in the world for manufacturing, clearly. Topic B is more focused on reducing trade barriers, right? So for definitions, we could look at something like comparative and absolute advantage. So comparative advantage is like how countries are going to have an advantage in producing goods that have the lowest opportunity cost, even if they're comparatively less efficient at producing those goods than other markets. So you might want to do a comparison here between, say, the UK and a market like Cambodia, where the big advantage is going to be labor costs. Maybe there are other advantages that the UK has that mean even though a country like Cambodia could produce probably everything cheaper, it makes more sense for them to focus on labor intensive products because that's where their lowest opportunity cost is. We could also use as an example, like the EU single market would be a good real world example for the effects of reducing trade barriers. So you can look at like how much German export there is to other countries within the European Union, in part because there are no trade barriers in place. So what's the explanation for why this works? Well, we would be looking at, I think you want to really focus on two things, right? The problem we have with making this argument is most of the time reducing trade barriers is about or trade barriers in general are about protecting your domestic markets. And you want other countries to have lower trade barriers so that you can export to them. What that means is I'm probably going to focus my analysis a lot on bilateral and free trade agreements where we negotiate, I still can't spell, where we negotiate lower barriers of trade with other countries so that we can have better access to their markets. So this is mutual reductions in tariffs with other countries that you have negotiated, and not just unilateral lowering of tariffs. But I might say countries are more likely to reduce trade restrictions with us on our goods if we reciprocate. If we lower tariffs on other countries, it's going to be easier to get them to lower tariffs on our goods, which makes our goods more price competitive because you're lowering the cost of things like tariffs and taxes that would have driven up those prices and made them more expensive for consumers in other markets. In terms of an evaluation, and then the other thing is reducing import tariffs could reduce the costs of input goods. So there is a direct impact on price competitiveness as well, because if we're importing primary goods to then manufacture into more advanced goods, we rely on, the import tariffs are going to make producing those goods more expensive. So if we remove those tariffs, again, we become more price competitive. So in terms of valuation, I've done two main things here. The loss of government revenue, right? So tariffs provide revenue to the state. Again, I want to tie this directly into exports if I can. So I've said may harm the ability to invest in infrastructure necessary for cost-effective international trade. What I mean there is ports and road infrastructure that was important for exporting. So there might be government investments or government subsidies that could help exports that we are no longer able to do because we have removed tariffs and therefore the revenue from tariffs. The other thing here is may undermine the firm's ability to serve a domestic market. So this is more to do with firms that have benefited from a high tariff environment and are serving a domestic market that maybe have economies of scale that allow them to be more cost effective and maybe allow them to export more. So there might be a general harm to companies that are serving a domestic market, but this might also affect exports because you're making those companies smaller, which means they're maybe less able to produce goods in a cost-effective way. In terms of a diagram for this, we've got, here you could just look at the fairly standard tariff diagram. So the effect of this would be for analyzing the cost of bringing goods into the country. So this is about that importing tariffs could reduce the cost of input goods. The diagram is illustrating why the price of goods coming into the UK is higher when you have higher tariffs. And also this would tie into the firm's ability to serve a domestic market. All right, well, I hope that's clear. In terms of a conclusion, it would just then be a comparison between these two policies. So between reducing regulations in the labor market and reducing tariffs, which one is likely to be the most effective based on the evaluations that we have provided. And probably we would maybe argue for reduced trade barriers on the basis that the UK is unlikely to have super competitive wages compared to low-wage manufacturing countries. That would be one example of how you could make that evaluation at the very end. So I hope this is helpful. Please do comment if you've got any suggestions about how you would answer this question, because obviously there's a lot of different arguments that you can make. And also let me know if you have any questions.